The courthouse was never silent, not really. Even when the judge's gavel rested on the block, and the lawyers had paused to shuffle papers, the building itself seemed to breathe. Old oak beams creaked under the weight of years. Fluorescent lights hummed faintly overhead, and the faintest cough or shuffle of shoes carried across the benches. On that particular morning in downtown Indianapolis, the air inside courtroom 4C felt heavier than usual. It was a high-profile case, one that had already drawn local news crews and curious onlookers who couldn't fit inside the small gallery. The stakes were enormous, not just for the defendant, a decorated canine handler accused of misconduct during a nighttime raid, but for the police department itself. If the prosecution proved its case, the verdict wouldn't stop at one officer. It would ripple through the entire force, raising questions about training, accountability, and trust. Jurors filed back into their seats after a short recess, their faces a mixture of fatigue and determination. Some scribbled notes on yellow legal pads. Others sat back with crossed arms, studying the attorneys with guarded eyes. A few looked toward the front row of the gallery, where a little girl sat swinging her legs, too small for her shoes to touch the floor. Her name was Emily. She was only 3 years old, and she clutched a stuffed bear whose fur had long since gone matted from years of love. Most assumed she was too young to matter, too young to understand why she was there, too young to add anything of value to a courtroom where every word could tilt the balance of justice. But the prosecution believed differently. Emily's guardian, a young woman with weary eyes, leaned down and whispered softly to her. Whatever was said seemed to give the child courage. Emily's grip on her teddy loosened just slightly, her gaze shifting toward the front of the room. There, on the polished tile floor beside the witness stand, sat a German shepherd. The dog was massive compared to Emily, his posture rigid, his coat gleaming under the fluorescent lights. He wore a black harness stamped with bold white letters, Police K9. His handler, a broad-shouldered man in uniform, sat upright with one hand wrapped firmly around the leash. The dog didn't move, didn't pant, didn't wag his tail. He was trained to be a statue until commanded otherwise. For weeks, the handler had insisted his dog had nothing to do with the accusations, brutality, intimidation, excessive force. Reports claimed the animal was only there to assist, not to harm. But behind closed doors, investigators had heard rumors. Rumors of a raid gone wrong. Rumors of a child who wouldn't stop crying afterward, pointing at a police dog in fear. Now that child sat in the courtroom, her wide eyes flicking nervously between the shepherd and the rows of strangers watching her every move. Judge leaned back in his chair, observing quietly. He had seen hundreds of witnesses take the stand over his long career, experts with polished voices, victims with trembling hands, officers with rehearsed testimonies. But he had never seen a 3-year-old walk willingly into such a spotlight. The prosecutor, a steady woman in her 40s with a reputation for patience, approached Emily carefully. "Would you like to say hello?" she asked gently, gesturing toward the front. Emily didn't answer. Instead, she slid off the wooden bench, her teddy bear dangling from one hand. Her small shoes tapped softly against the tile as she moved forward. The courtroom held its collective breath. Every eye followed her, jurors, attorneys, spectators. The defense attorney's jaw tightened. The handler shifted uncomfortably, tugging the leash as though to remind the dog of his presence. The shepherd's amber eyes stayed locked on the child, unblinking, unreadable. Emily stopped just a few feet away. The dog loomed above her, his head level with hers, even while sitting. She didn't flinch, though her bottom lip quivered slightly. The prosecutor crouched to meet her eye level. "Do you know this dog?" she asked softly. Emily nodded once, almost imperceptibly. The defense attorney immediately objected. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular." A toddler cannot be relied upon for testimony. The judge raised a hand, but didn't rule yet. His eyes stayed fixed on the girl. Something about her quiet determination held his attention. Emily's guardian stepped closer, her voice barely a whisper. "Go ahead, sweetie." Emily's teddy slipped from her grasp, landing softly on the floor. She raised a tiny finger, pointed directly at the shepherd, and whispered words that seemed to cut through the silence like a blade. Not everyone heard them at first. They were soft, almost swallowed by the cavernous room. But then she repeated herself, louder this time. "Bad dog." Gasps rippled across the courtroom. Jurors leaned forward in their seats, eyes wide. The handler froze, his knuckles white around the leash. The shepherd didn't move, but his stillness seemed heavier now, almost menacing. The prosecutor rose slowly, her expression calm, but her eyes sharp. She knew what this moment meant. For weeks they had struggled to connect the handler to the brutality alleged in the reports. Evidence was scarce, testimonies conflicting. But here, in front of 12 ordinary citizens, a child had spoken with clarity no adult could match. The defense attorney shot to his feet again, shouting objections, insisting Emily was confused. But the words had already landed, and their echo seemed to hang in the air long after she'd spoken. The judge banged his gavel, demanding order, but even he couldn't mask his surprise. He glanced at the jurors, noting their expressions, shock, curiosity, and something else. Belief. Emily bent down, picked up her teddy, and hugged it tightly against her chest. She didn't say another word. She didn't have to. The prosecutor straightened, her voice steady. "No further questions at this time." The judge cleared his throat. "We will proceed after a short recess." As the bailiff announced the break, the room erupted into hushed whispers. Reporters scribbled furiously, already imagining headlines. Jurors exchanged glances that spoke volumes. And at the center of it all, Emily walked back to her guardian, unaware of the storm she had just unleashed. For her, it had been simple. A dog she remembered from a frightening night had been sitting there, and she had told the truth as only a child could. For everyone else, the trial had shifted forever. The recess bell echoed faintly through the hallways, yet no one in courtroom 4C moved quickly. Instead of the usual rush to stretch legs or grab coffee, people lingered, whispering, replaying the moment they had just witnessed. Did she really say that? A juror muttered under his breath as he gathered his notes. "She's 3 years old," another answered softly. But she didn't even hesitate. At the front, the handler tightened his grip on the leash as if grounding himself. His face had turned a pale shade of gray, though he kept his jaw locked in place. The German shepherd at his side remained perfectly still, but the atmosphere around them had shifted. Once seen as a proud symbol of discipline, the animal now seemed a silent witness to something darker. The defense attorney hurried toward his client, lowering his voice. "She's a child. They can't rely on her testimony. We'll strike it down. Trust me." The handler didn't respond. His eyes followed Emily as she returned to her guardian's side. The little girl sat back down, hugging her teddy with fierce determination. She was unaware of the legal panic she had caused, but the way she stared at the dog told everyone she wasn't mistaken. The judge, too, had noticed. During his decades on the bench, Judge Carver had learned to read the undercurrents in a courtroom. He had seen lies wrapped in eloquence, truths hidden behind rehearsed calm. What he had just seen from Emily was different. There had been no hesitation, no confusion. Just raw honesty. The kind of honesty only a child, untouched by legal games, could give. When recess ended, the bailiff called the court back into session. The murmurs died, and jurors filed into their seats again, still buzzing with private thoughts. The prosecutor, Ms. Reynolds, rose with quiet authority. She knew she had to handle this moment carefully. It was one thing for Emily to say 2 words. It was another to prove those words carried weight beyond emotion. If she pressed too hard, the defense would call it manipulation. If she backed off, the moment could slip away. "Your Honor," Reynolds began, "the testimony we just witnessed cannot be dismissed as childish play. Recognition, especially under stress, is a powerful thing. And we intend to show why those 2 words matter." The defense attorney shot up immediately. "Your Honor, I move to strike this from the record. The child is too young to understand the gravity of this setting. She could have been influenced by her guardian, by the media, by anything." "Sit down, Mr. Cole," Judge Carver interrupted firmly. His gravelly voice carried authority that silenced the room. "Your motion is noted. For now, the testimony stands. Continue, Ms. Reynolds." The jurors leaned forward. Reynolds nodded to an assistant, who carried a manila folder toward the evidence table. She carefully laid out several glossy photographs, still shots taken from the night of the raid. Grainy, but clear enough. Flashlights illuminated a yard, shadows of men in tactical gear stretching across fences. And there in the corner of one image stood the same German Shepherd. The courtroom collectively inhaled. "This," Reynolds said, pointing, "is the defendant's canine at the scene where the alleged assault took place. This photograph has been authenticated by timestamp and metadata. But photographs don't always tell the whole story." She paused, glancing toward Emily. The little girl had tucked her teddy under her chin, watching with wide eyes. Reynolds didn't want to frighten her further. Instead, she turned back to the jury. "What does matter," Reynolds continued, "is that this child, without being shown these photos, without coaching, identified the dog in this room as the same one involved that night. That recognition came not from imagination, but from memory." Cole, the defense attorney, sprang up again. "Objection. Speculation. You cannot claim to know what the child remembers." Carver's gavel struck once. Overruled. "The jury will consider the evidence as presented." The handler's face darkened. He shifted in his seat, his once confident posture eroding under the weight of attention that Reynolds pressed on. "This is not about confusing one dog with another. Police K9S are unique distinctive markings, distinctive training." Emily recognized what adults have been too afraid to say aloud. She let her words hang in the air. Silence followed, broken only by the scratching of jurors' pens. Then, unexpectedly, Emily's guardian raised her hand, asking permission to speak. "Your Honor," she said softly, "may I explain what Emily told me after that night?" Carver considered, then nodded cautiously. Briefly, the guardian's voice trembled. "She woke up screaming. For days, she wouldn't go near any dog. When she saw this one today, she froze like she was back there again. She didn't even need to think. She just knew." Emily buried her face in her teddy, unaware of the tears welling in her guardian's eyes. The jury had heard enough to feel the shift. The defense could argue technicalities all day, but emotion had already begun weaving its thread. Cole tried to regain control. He called the handler to the stand. Sergeant Daniel Harris, 38 years old, decorated with commendations, walked stiffly to the witness chair. His uniform was immaculate, his badge polished, his jaw locked. He spoke with the crispness of a career officer. "My canine partner has never acted outside of protocol," he said firmly. "We follow procedure, always." "And on the night in question?" Cole prompted. Harris leaned forward, eyes burning with restrained anger. "We entered a volatile environment. We did what was necessary to protect ourselves and secure the premises. No one was harmed by my canine, but jurors shifted uncomfortably." His words sounded rehearsed, his tone defensive. And then Reynolds stood. "Sergeant Harris," she said coolly, "how do you explain a 3-year-old identifying your dog without hesitation?" Harris's jaw twitched. Children imagine things. Reynolds arched an eyebrow. Imagine the exact dog in the exact courtroom tied to the exact raid. That's a remarkable imagination. Cole objected again, but the damage was done. The jurors weren't just hearing testimony anymore. They were feeling the tension. Harris's hand flexed on the armrest, knuckles white. For the first time, his composure faltered. Emily peeked out from behind her teddy and stared at him. It was only a glance, but the room felt it. Innocence against authority. Truth against power. And power was starting to look brittle. When court adjourned that day, the crowd spilled into the hall, buzzing louder than before. Reporters thrust microphones forward, their questions colliding over one another. Did you hear her say it? Is this the break the case needed? Can the defense recover from this? Inside the jury room, however, it was quieter, but the shift was undeniable. A child's 2 words had already begun unraveling a carefully constructed defense. And outside, the world was starting to watch. The sun outside the courthouse had already started sinking when the court reconvened for the afternoon session. A faint golden light filtered through the tall windows, spilling across the floor in long, uneven streaks. Inside, the atmosphere had changed. The morning had ended with whispers of disbelief, but now the whispers had transformed into speculation, heavy with expectation. Everyone knew the defense was in trouble. The jurors shuffled back into their seats, some carrying styrofoam cups of coffee, others chewing pens, as though caffeine alone wouldn't keep them alert for what was about to unfold. They weren't tired anymore. Emily's 2 words had jolted them awake. At the prosecution's table, Ms. Reynolds sat calm, her files neatly stacked, but her eyes betrayed an energy she rarely showed. She knew momentum was on her side now. If she played her next moves carefully, she could turn a child's fragile testimony into a foundation strong enough to withstand every objection the defense hurled at it. Across the aisle, Cole, the defense attorney, was a different story. He looked rattled, his tie loosened, his papers scattered. His client, Sergeant Harris, remained stony-faced, but the subtle twitch in his jawline gave him away. He was unraveling, piece by piece. The bailiff called the court to order, and Judge Carver returned to his bench. Ladies and gentlemen, we will continue with testimony. Ms. Reynolds, you may proceed. Reynolds rose and glanced toward the jury. The prosecution calls Dr. Susan Clark, child psychologist. A tall woman with kind eyes and a steady voice approached the stand. She was sworn in, then seated. Reynolds began with calm precision. Dr. Clark, in your professional opinion, how reliable is recognition in children of Emily's age? Dr. Clark folded her hands. Recognition can be remarkably accurate, especially when tied to emotionally charged events. A 3-year-old may not recall dates or sequences, but they often remember faces, places, and yes, animals. Trauma imprints memory. It becomes vivid, sometimes painfully so. Would you say her identification of the dog was consistent with that? Reynolds pressed. Yes, Clark said firmly. Her response was spontaneous. Children that young rarely fabricate such specific recognition. And if they do, it usually collapses under follow-up questioning. Emily's did not. Cole leapt to his feet. Objection. The witness is speculating about this specific child. Carver adjusted his glasses. Overruled. A jury may weigh the credibility of expert testimony. Reynolds nodded and continued. So, in your professional opinion, Emily's words carry weight? They carry significant weight, Clark replied. The jury scribbled notes furiously. Reynolds let the point sink in before sitting down. Cole rose quickly, trying to recover ground. Dr. Clark, isn't it also true that children are highly suggestible? That they may repeat what they've been told? Yes, Clark admitted, but Emily's manner did not suggest suggestion. She wasn't prompted. Her recognition was self-initiated. Cole's jaw tightened. He ended the cross-examination quickly, but the damage was already done. The jurors weren't just hearing about Emily's words anymore. They were hearing why those words mattered. Next, Reynolds called another witness, Officer Leonard Marks, a patrolman who had been present the night of the raid. Unlike Harris, Marks looked uneasy, his uniform wrinkled, his hands fidgeting as he swore the oath. "Officer Marks," Reynolds began, "describe what you saw that night." Marks hesitated. We entered the premises on Harris's command. A K-9 was deployed. The room grew still. Deployed in what way? Reynolds asked. Marks swallowed hard. He went for a suspect. But there was confusion. The suspect wasn't resisting. He was on the ground. Gasps fluttered across the gallery. Cole was on his feet instantly. Objection. This contradicts his earlier written report. Reynolds turned sharply. Perhaps because his earlier report was written under pressure. Speculation. Cole barked. "Enough," Carver snapped, slamming his gavel. "The witness will continue. Mr. Marks, answer carefully." Marks's eyes darted to Harris, whose glare could have cut steel. He looked back at Reynolds, then at the jury. His voice dropped, almost to a whisper. The dog didn't stop when commanded. It kept going. The screams. He faltered. It wasn't right. The jurors froze, their pens hanging midair. Reynolds seized the moment. Did Sergeant Harris intervene? No, Marks admitted. His shoulders sagged as though a great weight had been released. He didn't stop it. The room erupted in murmurs, the tension snapping like a taut wire. Carver's gavel thundered. "Order! Order in the court!" Cole scrambled to redirect, but everyone had heard it. Another officer admitting what Harris had denied. Emily's words were no longer isolated. They had been given legs, a spine, a witness to carry them forward. By the time the court adjourned for the evening, the media frenzy outside was unstoppable. Cameras flashed, microphones thrust forward, headlines already drafted in the glow of laptops. Child points to police. In court. Witness confirms misconduct during raid. K-9 handler under fire after explosive testimony. Emily and her guardian were shielded from the chaos by deputies as they slipped into a waiting car. Emily was asleep before they even left the courthouse steps, her teddy bear clutched tightly in her arms. But for the adults, sleep would not come easily. Inside his small apartment, Harris sat alone that night, staring at the leash coiled on his kitchen table. His K-9, now kenneled at the department, wouldn't be there to greet him. The silence felt oppressive. For years, he had been untouchable, his word enough to silence complaints. But now a 3-year-old had cracked his armor. He slammed his fist on the table, rattling the leash. "A kid," he muttered. "A damn kid." Across town, Reynolds sat in her office, staring at Emily's crayon drawing left behind during recess. A crude house, flashing lights, a large dog. Simple, but powerful. She pinned it to her corkboard. It wasn't just evidence. It was truth unfiltered. And truth had a way of spreading. The next morning promised another battle in court. But as the city slept uneasily, one thing was already clear. The defense's carefully crafted wall was crumbling, and it had started with the quietest voice in the room. Morning broke gray and heavy over the courthouse, as if the sky itself sensed the storm about to unfold. By the time Judge Carver's gavel echoed through the room, every seat was filled. Reporters jammed the back rows. Jurors shifted uneasily, and the gallery buzzed with the kind of electricity reserved for history in the making. The trial was no longer just about one raid or one officer. It had become a referendum on power, trust, and the fragile innocence of a child who had spoken 2 small words. Sergeant Harris sat stiffly at the defense table, jaw clenched, eyes fixed forward. He had always been the image of discipline, the canine handler whose reputation preceded him in precinct after precinct. But now he looked cornered, every muscle taut, as though bracing for an impact he couldn't stop. Cole, his defense attorney, whispered furiously in his ear. His usual swagger had evaporated, leaving only sharp edges and rising panic. They had to shift the narrative, fast, before the prosecution tightened the noose. "Court is in session," Judge Carver announced. His voice carried a gravity that silenced the room. "Ms. Reynolds, you may call your next witness." Reynolds stood, calm as a surgeon. The prosecution calls Officer Daniel Price. A hush fell as a tall, broad-shouldered man stepped into the witness box. His uniform was immaculate, his expression grave. Unlike Marks the day before, Price had always been considered Harris's ally, his partner on multiple raids, his backup when things turned violent. If Price broke ranks, the defense would be in free fall. After being sworn in, Reynolds wasted no time. "Officer Price, were you present on the night of the raid?" "Yes," Price said, his voice steady but low. "What did you observe?" Price hesitated, glancing briefly at Harris before focusing on the jury. "I observed misuse of force." The K-9 was directed at a suspect who was already restrained. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Harris's head snapped toward him, eyes blazing. Reynolds pressed gently. "Directed? By whom?" Price swallowed hard. "By Sergeant Harris." The room erupted into murmurs. Carver's gavel thundered. "Order! The gallery will remain silent or be cleared." Reynolds let the words hang in the air, then asked, "Did Sergeant Harris make any attempt to stop the attack once it began?" "No," Price said, his voice stronger now. "He didn't. In fact, he ordered me to write my report in a way that downplayed what happened." Gasps again. This time, even the jurors glanced at one another in shock. Reynolds nodded. "So you were pressured to falsify your report?" "Yes," Price admitted. Cole bolted to his feet. "Objection. Hearsay, coercion claims without corroboration." But Carver cut him off. "Overruled. The witness is testifying to his direct experience." The defense was bleeding. Credibility. Cole approached for cross-examination, his voice sharp, almost desperate. "Officer Price, isn't it true you're testifying today under the threat of disciplinary action yourself?" Price stiffened. "I was offered immunity in exchange for the truth." "Yes. So you benefit by accusing my client." "I benefit," Price shot back, "by not lying anymore." The jury leaned forward, captivated. Harris's reputation, once untouchable, was crumbling right before their eyes. By lunchtime, the courthouse steps were a circus. Satellite trucks lined the block. Protesters and supporters clashed with signs. "Justice for Emily versus Back the Blue." The air smelled of hot asphalt, coffee, and tension. National networks aired live coverage. Commentators debated whether Emily's testimony was a breakthrough for accountability or a dangerous precedent for child witnesses. But for ordinary viewers watching at home, one thing was clear. A decorated officer was being accused not by criminals, but by his own fellow officers, and by the smallest voice of all. Inside, Harris began to unravel. As court resumed, he scribbled furiously on a legal pad, his handwriting jagged. He shoved the notes toward Cole. "Discredit the kid. Push harder. Attack the guardian." Cole read them, his face pale. He knew attacking a 3-year-old in front of a jury was suicide, but Harris's eyes burned with fury. He couldn't stand that a child was undoing everything he'd built. Reynolds, sensing his agitation, moved to her next strike. She produced evidence, photos taken during the raid. Enlarged, grainy, but clear enough to show a man on the ground, hands visible. A dog latched onto his arm. "This," Reynolds said, holding the photo aloft, "is the truth Sergeant Harris wanted hidden. This is what Emily remembered when she saw that dog. The jurors stared at the images, their faces hardening. Cole objected again, arguing chain of custody, relevance, even claiming the photos were inflammatory. But Carver denied him each time. The defense's objections were starting to sound more like flailing than strategy. As the day wore on, the atmosphere grew heavier. The courtroom smelled faintly of sweat and coffee, the weight of truth pressing down on everyone present. Harris sat rigid, but his mask was cracking. At one point, when Reynolds read a section of Marks's written testimony aloud, Harris muttered under his breath, "Coward." It was loud enough for the jury to hear. Carver slammed his gavel. "Sergeant Harris, one more outburst and you'll be held in contempt." For the first time, the jury saw not the composed officer, but the temper boiling beneath by adjournment. The headlines had already written themselves. Partner testifies against decorated. Canine handler photos reveal shocking truth. Behind raid, Sergeant Harris loses. Composure in Corton, a quiet corner of the courthouse. Emily sat on her guardian's lap, doodling with crayons provided by a kind clerk. She didn't understand the storm swirling around her. To her, the courtroom was just a big, scary room full of grown-ups arguing. But every stroke of her crayon, every quiet giggle, reminded those who saw her that innocence had been dragged into this fight, and innocence was winning. That night, CABLE News replayed her small voice saying, "That doggy," over and over again, juxtaposed against the haunting photographs from the raid. The contrast was devastating, and for Harris, watching from his apartment as anchors dissected his every expression, every tick, it was unbearable. The leash on his table sat untouched, a symbol of everything he was losing. He muttered to himself, "They're all turning on me. Even Price, even Marks, and all because of her." His fists clenched. His control, once absolute, was slipping. Meanwhile, Reynolds sat in her office, reviewing her notes. She knew the defense wasn't finished. Cole would come back swinging, desperate to salvage his client. He might attack Emily's guardian, dig into the past, or even question Emily's competency again. But Reynolds was ready, because now the truth wasn't just whispered. It was out in the open, clawing its way into headlines, jurors' hearts, and the conscience of a watching nation. The walls were closing in on Sergeant Harris, and the cracks in his armor were spreading faster than even he could contain. The morning sunlight spilled into courtroom 4C like liquid gold, reflecting off the polished wooden benches and casting long shadows across the faces of jurors, reporters, and court staff. The room hummed with tension, thicker than the caffeine-scented air. It was the fifth day of the trial, and the stakes had escalated beyond any legal argument. It had become a battle of perception, morality, and power. Emily, sitting quietly on her guardian's lap in the front row, clutched her teddy bear tighter than ever. Her wide eyes scanned the room, not comprehending the intricacies of the case, but absorbing the energy, the tension, the adult's subtle shifts in posture and expression. Even at 3, she seemed to understand that something serious was happening, that her tiny voice carried more weight than most could fathom. At the defense table, Sergeant Harris sat like a coiled spring. His jaw was set, knuckles white on the edge of the table, as if trying to channel control into a body that no longer responded to it. Around him, the courtroom seemed to press inward. Every photograph, every testimony from the prior day, had chipped away at the fortress of authority he had built over years. Cole, his defense attorney, was frantic but precise. He shuffled papers, whispered last-minute strategies, and stared at the jurors as though sheer will could reverse the mounting impression against his client. He knew attacking Emily directly would be political and moral suicide, but he also knew that if her testimony held, Harris faced the very real possibility of conviction. "Your Honor," Cole said, standing abruptly, "before we continue, I would like to request a motion to exclude any further discussion of the child's statements." The prosecution is relying on an unqualified witness whose age makes her incapable of understanding the proceedings. Judge Carver looked up from his bench, his expression unreadable. The objection is noted, Mr. Cole. For the time being, the jury will consider the child's statements along with all other evidence presented. Continue, Ms. Reynolds. The room settled into an uneasy quiet. Reynolds rose, her heels clicking against the wooden floor. She took a slow, deliberate breath and addressed the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, voice calm but firm. "Today, you will hear directly from a witness whose truth has already shaken this courtroom. We will show that even the smallest voice can speak volumes, that courage isn't measured by age, but by honesty and clarity." Emily's guardian glanced down at her daughter, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "It's okay, sweetie," she whispered. Emily hugged her teddy closer, but didn't respond. She didn't need to. The first witness of the morning was called, Officer Tanya Mitchell, who had arrived at the scene minutes after the raid. She was younger than most in the department and had a reputation for candor. Her uniform was neatly pressed, but the weight of what she had seen the night of the raid showed in her eyes. After being sworn in, she took the stand. "I arrived at the scene shortly after the K-9 had been deployed," she began. "I witnessed Sergeant Harris giving commands to his dog while the suspect was already restrained on the ground. I also observed injuries that seemed excessive given the circumstances." The courtroom murmured, and Cole sprang to his feet. "Objection. This is opinion, not fact." Judge Carver rapped his gavel sharply. "Overruled. The witness may continue." Mitchell nodded, continuing carefully. "The suspect did not resist arrest. The K-9's actions were unnecessary and potentially harmful. I later documented everything in my report, but my report was altered before submission. I felt pressured to conform to Sergeant Harris's account." The jurors scribbled rapidly, eyes wide. Emily's small voice from the prior days had been reinforced by adult testimony. The tiniest witness in the room had started the chain reaction, but it was now undeniable that it extended into the adult sphere. Cole's attempts to counter were increasingly frantic. He questioned Mitchell aggressively, but she remained composed. "I am not here to speculate," she said evenly. "I am reporting exactly what I saw." The defense tried shifting strategy next. They called a psychologist to challenge Emily's credibility, arguing that children of her age could be influenced or confused. The expert walked the jurors through theories of suggestion, imagination, and memory distortion, but when the prosecutor followed up, she demonstrated that Emily had identified the dog without prompts, independent of influence or coaching. Even the judge seemed struck by the clarity of the evidence. He paused, adjusted his glasses, and glanced at the jury. There was no denying the weight of Emily's recognition, now reinforced by multiple officers' corroboration. As the morning wore on, tension mounted. The gallery buzzed with reporters, capturing every detail. Outside the courthouse, protesters waved signs calling for accountability, while others defended police, creating a visible, shouting divide. But inside, the courtroom felt contained, electric, a pressure cooker of truths colliding with authority. Then it was time for Emily. Though she didn't fully understand, the prosecutor and guardian led her carefully to the stand. She clutched her teddy bear tightly, stepping onto the witness platform with the tiniest shiver. Her presence alone quieted the courtroom. Reynolds crouched slightly to meet Emily's gaze. "Do you remember the doggy you saw that night?" she asked softly. Emily nodded, eyes wide, lips pressed together in concentration. "Yes," she whispered. "Can you tell the jury what you remember?" The room leaned in. Emily pointed at the German shepherd, now sitting silently beside Harris. "Bad dog," she said, her voice small but unmistakable. Gasps filled the room. Even hardened reporters in the back covered their mouths. Jurors leaned forward. Adults at the prosecution table exchanged silent nods. Harris's face tightened, veins standing out on his forehead. The handler's mask of authority was cracking further, piece by piece. The judge pounded his gavel. Order, order in the courtroom. But nothing could erase the impact. Emily had spoken, and the room had heard. The rest of the afternoon was spent reinforcing her testimony. Crayons, drawings, and gentle questioning revealed vivid details of the raid. Flashing lights, shadows, a man restrained, and a dog that hadn't been stopped. Each stroke, each word, layered the truth that Harris had tried to hide. Cole grew increasingly frantic. He attempted to discredit Emily's guardian, claiming coaching or influence. But the guardian's composure, the consistency of Emily's prior statements, and the independent corroboration from officers left little room for doubt. By the time the court adjourned, whispers of the day's events had already spread through social media and national news. Headlines screamed, "Toddler witness shines light on police." Raid 3-year-old's words confirm officer misconduct. Justice moves slowly. But even the smallest voice counts. Harris sat alone in his office, staring at the photographs on his desk. His canine sat in the kennel at the precinct, silent, waiting. The leash coiled neatly on the table, but to him, it symbolized everything slipping out of his control. The words of a child, the statements of fellow officers, the drawn evidence, they were all converging against him. Outside, Emily returned home with her guardian. She played quietly in the backyard, unaware that the world had shifted around her. The teddy bear hugged tightly against her chest was now a silent witness to a trial that had changed lives. Reynolds returned to her office, reviewing the day's notes and photographs. She knew the defense would continue to fight, more desperately than before. They would attack, obfuscate, and manipulate every angle available. But truth, reinforced by a child's clarity and corroborated by adults, was proving resilient. And for the first time, it felt unstoppable. The courthouse seemed almost alive that morning, the sun spilling through the tall windows in a harsh, golden glare that reflected off polished wood and glass. Courtroom 4C was packed beyond capacity. Reporters leaned forward with cameras trained on the proceedings. Jurors sat upright, their attention razor-sharp. Even the bailiffs moved more deliberately, sensing the day's significance. The air hummed with anticipation. Weeks of testimony, photographs, and recollections had all led to this moment. The weight of truth pressed on every soul inside the courtroom, heavy and relentless. Sergeant Harris sat at the defense table, a thin veneer of composure masking the storm inside. His once impervious reputation was cracking, tiny fissures spreading into deep fractures. Every witness, every photograph, every word from Emily's lips had chipped away at the carefully constructed armor he had spent years building. His knuckles were white as he gripped the edge of the table, jaw locked. But it was clear to everyone watching. He was beginning to unravel. Cole whispered into Harris's ear, attempting to steady him. "We have to fight back. Attack the witness. Question her guardian. Shift the narrative." Harris shook his head minutely, voice taut. "It's too late, everyone. They believe her. Even Marks, even Price." Cole's eyes widened. He hadn't anticipated this depth of collapse. The prosecution had methodically built a fortress of truth, and it rested now on the smallest, most unassuming witness in the room. Judge Carver rapped his gavel. "The court will come to order. Ms. Reynolds, please proceed." Reynolds rose, her heels clicking against the floor with a quiet rhythm that echoed throughout the room. Her calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the chaos she had already orchestrated against the defense's narrative. Today, she would reinforce Emily's observations in a way that left no room for doubt. The first witness called was Officer Melissa Tran, a canine trainer who had been brought in to assess the dog's behavior during the raid. Tran was meticulous, analytical, and precise. speaking in technical language about canine training, behavioral responses, and the importance of handler control. After being sworn in, she began, "I have reviewed the case and observed the canine involved. Based on the available footage and witness testimony, it is clear that the dog responded beyond the necessary scope of its training. It did not act defensively or reactively as trained, but aggressively and under direct instruction from the handler." Harris's face tightened as Tran elaborated on how the dog's aggression could be mitigated with proper commands, which, according to evidence, were not issued during the raid. The jury leaned forward, scribbling notes, absorbing the stark juxtaposition of professional standards versus the behavior that had unfolded that night. Reynolds moved with measured precision. "Officer Tran, based on your expertise, what does this indicate about the handler's role?" Tran's voice was firm. "It indicates negligence, poor judgment, and a failure to maintain control." The murmurs in the courtroom were subtle but widespread. Even those sympathetic to law enforcement couldn't ignore the clarity of her assessment. Cole's strategy was becoming increasingly desperate. He attempted to discredit Tran, arguing that the assessment was subjective, biased, and theoretical. But Reynolds was ready. She presented prior reports, timestamps, and side-by-side comparisons showing the dog's actions and Harris's commands, or lack thereof. The evidence spoke louder than any argument. Then it was Emily's turn. Though she didn't fully understand the gravity, the prosecutor and her guardian led her carefully back to the stand. She clutched her teddy tightly, stepping up with a small shiver. The room went quiet, every adult holding their breath. Reynolds crouched to meet her gaze. "Emily, can you tell us what happened with the dog that night?" Emily looked up at the German shepherd, now sitting calmly beside Harris, and whispered with clarity, "It hurt him." The courtroom reacted immediately. Gasps, murmurs, and the subtle shift of jurors leaning forward filled the room. Even Harris's hand twitched slightly on the table. "Can you tell the jury who told you to say that?" Reynolds asked gently. Emily shook her head. "No one. I saw it." Her guardian's eyes shimmered with tears, but she didn't speak. She didn't have to. The room understood. This was truth spoken plainly, without influence, manipulation, or coaching. Reynolds turned toward the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is not imagination. This is observation." Emily witnessed events and recalled them accurately, independent of any adult influence. The defense attorney attempted one final attack. "Your Honor, the child's age makes her testimony unreliable. She cannot understand." Carver rapped his gavel sharply. Sustained only to the extent that the jury is instructed to weigh all evidence, including age. But the testimony remains in the record. Harris's jaw tightened, veins in his neck protruding. He muttered under his breath, almost inaudibly, "This isn't real." It was real. And the truth was overwhelming. Reynolds followed up with visual evidence. Crayon drawings Emily had made, depicting flashing lights, shadows, and a dog that had attacked a restrained man. The images were crude, but unmistakably accurate. Jurors leaned forward, captivated by the visual reinforcement of Emily's statements. For hours, the trial proceeded with precision. Each witness, each piece of evidence, reinforced Emily's observations. Marks, Price, and Tran testified with calm consistency. Reynolds asked questions that allowed Emily's memory to shine. The defense grew more frantic, their objections more frequent, but each was overruled or countered by overwhelming corroboration. By late afternoon, the momentum was undeniable. The jury, who had entered the day neutral and attentive, now appeared engaged and almost tense with the gravity of what they had seen. Even the most skeptical among them couldn't dismiss the clarity of Emily's memory and the corroboration from professional witnesses. Harris sat slumped slightly in his chair. His hand hovered over his legal pads, but he didn't write. His eyes darted repeatedly to Emily, the German shepherd, the jury, the gallery, all confirming the erosion of his authority. The day concluded with the judge instructing the court to adjourn. Outside, the press captured every moment of movement, every expression, and every whispered conversation. Emily returned home, unaware that her words had now made national headlines. Toddler's testimony validates officers' reports. K-9 handler's misconduct. Confirmed by child witness. Smallest voice in courtroom holds largest. Impact back at the courthouse. Reynolds reviewed her notes. Each piece of evidence, each statement, each visual cue had strengthened the case. The prosecution's strategy, anchored by Emily's testimony, had turned the courtroom into a fortress of truth. Harris returned home that evening, the weight of inevitability pressing down on him. The leash lay coiled on the table, a silent reminder of his loss of control. The thought of facing another day in court, with his credibility further eroding, left him exhausted and pale. And yet, the trial wasn't over. The next session promised the climax of revelations, the moment when Emily's observations would intersect with hard evidence in a way that would make it impossible to ignore the truth. For Emily, the day had been long and confusing, but as she hugged her teddy in bed that night, she slept peacefully. Unaware of the ripples she had created, she embodied the quiet courage that had shaken adults, exposed misconduct, and moved justice forward, one small step at a time. The next morning dawned gray and restless, the clouds heavy with the kind of moisture that makes air thick and every footstep sound heavier. Courtroom 4C was packed once more, but the energy had shifted. Spectators, reporters, and even jurors seemed to carry the lingering weight of what had been revealed. The small courtroom, usually just a room of procedure, now felt like the epicenter of justice itself. Sergeant Harris sat at the defense table, rigid as a soldier at attention, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed him. Each day had been another assault on his carefully cultivated reputation. Each testimony another fissure in the armor he had worn for years. Now, with Emily's testimony corroborated by multiple officers and visual evidence, the cracks had widened into CHASMS. Cole, his attorney, leaned over, whispering rapidly. His normally calm, precise manner had deteriorated into an almost manic insistence. "You have to hold your ground," he said. "We can't let them pin this entirely on you. Attack the procedure. Attack the chain of custody. Question the jurors' perception." Harris shook his head, almost imperceptibly. His eyes kept returning to Emily, sitting quietly in the gallery with her guardian, her teddy bear clutched tightly. The realization that the child's clarity, her unprompted recognition, had undone his years of authority was sinking in. "It's too late," he muttered under his breath. Judge Carver called the courtroom to order. "We will proceed with the final witness testimony before closing arguments." Reynolds rose, calm and commanding. "Your Honor, the prosecution calls Detective Laura Simmons, lead investigator on the case." Simmons was a veteran officer, meticulous and methodical. Her experience carried weight, and her credibility was unquestioned. She took the stand and was sworn in. "Detective Simmons," Reynolds began, "please summarize the findings of your investigation." Simmons straightened, her voice firm. "We reviewed all reports, body cam footage, photographs, and statements from witnesses. It is clear that the K-9 was deployed unnecessarily, and that the actions taken during the raid were inconsistent with department protocol. Furthermore, multiple officers have corroborated the sequence of events that led to the suspect being injured while restrained." The jurors leaned forward, absorbing the gravity. Each corroboration was another blow against Harris's defense. "Did you find evidence that Sergeant Harris gave direct commands to the K-9 during these events?" Reynolds asked. "Yes," Simmons replied. "We have audio recordings from the raid, statements from other officers, and visual evidence that indicate the handler was actively directing the canine during the incident. Harris's hand twitched in response, his knuckles white against the table. For the first time, the defense attorney's whispered instructions seemed powerless. Reynolds continued, carefully drawing the jury's attention to the alignment of events. Officer Marks, Officer Price, Officer Mitchell, and Officer Tran all confirmed the sequence of events. Each independently observed the same pattern of negligence and misuse. Cole tried once more to regain footing. He rose, voice sharp. "Detective Simmons, isn't it true that memory can be faulty? Witness recollection may be inaccurate or influenced by suggestion." Simmons shook her head, firm. "We cross-reference testimony with visual and audio evidence. The accounts are consistent and reliable. The child witness, Emily, independently identified the canine without influence or coaching, and her statements have been corroborated by adult witnesses." The jury exchanged glances, their pens moving faster now. Harris's posture had shifted subtly. The energy that once allowed him to dominate a room was gone. He looked smaller, almost diminished under the weight of undeniable truth. Courtroom clerk announced a brief recess before closing arguments. Outside, reporters swarmed the steps, capturing every detail. National media outlets were live streaming the trial, broadcasting Emily's words, the officer testimonies, and the images of the raid to a captivated audience. Social media exploded. Headlines splashed across screens. Toddler testifies against K9. Handler truth prevails. Multiple officers corroborate child witness misconduct exposed. Public awaits verdict inside. The pressure on Harris was suffocating. He stared at the leash coiled neatly on the table in front of him, a symbol of control he no longer possessed. Each piece of evidence, every corroborating witness, every small word from Emily had chipped away at the empire of authority he had built. After recess, the closing arguments began. Reynolds rose first, moving deliberately, her voice steady and resonant. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, "we have seen how power can be misused, how authority can mask wrongdoing. But today, we have witnessed the courage of a child whose words have cut through deception and fear. Emily has reminded us all that truth is not measured by age, but by clarity, honesty, and courage." She gestured toward the German shepherd, now calm, sitting obediently beside Harris. "The evidence, corroborated by officers, photographs, and investigative findings, confirms what Emily saw and told us. Misuse of authority, negligence, and failure to act have been documented. Justice requires acknowledgement, accountability, and consequence." Reynolds's words lingered in the air, precise and undeniable. She returned to her seat, leaving the courtroom hushed. Cole rose for the defense, trying to muster authority. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, voice sharp but increasingly strained, "we are being asked to base a verdict on the observations of a child, the recollections of officers under pressure, and images that may misrepresent reality. Sergeant Harris has served honorably. He has devoted his life to protecting the community. Do not allow emotion to outweigh reason." He paused, scanning the jury. "Consider the context. Consider what is at stake. And remember that the courtroom is not a place for spectacle, but for measured judgment." Yet, even as Cole spoke, the jurors' attention wavered, caught between his appeals and the overwhelming consistency of the evidence presented over days. The child's voice, the corroborations, the visual proof, all of it formed a narrative too solid to ignore. Judge Carver finally addressed the court. "Members of the jury, you have heard all evidence, testimony, and arguments. The case is now in your hands. You will retire to deliberate and return a verdict when ready." The jurors filed out, the courtroom slowly emptying. Harris remained at the table, shoulders slumped, staring at the floor. His eyes occasionally flicked toward Emily, still seated in the gallery, her small face serene and unaware of the storm she had stirred. Cole muttered instructions, but his voice lacked the authority it once carried. Harris had nothing left to lean on. The walls had closed in, and the truth had taken root in the minds of 12 ordinary citizens tasked with delivering justice. Outside, the city seemed to hold its breath. News vans lined the streets, reporters spoke rapidly into cameras, and a crowd gathered at the courthouse steps. Emily's 2 words had ignited something far larger than anyone anticipated. They had become a catalyst for accountability, a reminder that courage can be found in the smallest voices. Back inside, the jury began deliberations, each member silently weighing evidence, testimony, and the unassailable clarity of Emily's observations. Hours passed. The room was quiet, except for the scratch of pens on paper, the occasional sigh, and the faint hum of distant traffic. Harris sat alone with his thoughts, the weight of inevitability pressing down. For the first time in his career, he understood the fragility of power, the limits of authority, and the unstoppable force of truth. By the end of the day, the stage was set. The verdict would not only decide the fate of Sergeant Harris, but also mark the culmination of a trial in which a 3-year-old's honesty had ignited a reckoning. The courthouse was unusually still that morning, an almost tangible tension lingering in the air. Reporters, spectators, and courthouse staff filed in early, all anticipating the culmination of a trial that had captivated not just the city, but the nation. Courtroom 4C, once just a hall of procedure, had become a crucible for justice, witness to the unraveling of one man's authority and the triumph of a child's honesty. Emily sat on her guardian's lap in the front row, teddy bear clutched tightly. She did not understand the magnitude of the day, only that it was important, and that the grown-ups around her seemed nervous, anxious, and attentive. Her small voice, spoken weeks before in the simple words, "Bad dog," had ignited a chain of events that no one could have anticipated. Sergeant Harris sat at the defense table, jaw tight, shoulders rigid. The prior days had stripped away his defenses. His officer's testimony, corroborated evidence, visual proof, and Emily's testimony had combined to erode the facade he had spent years constructing. Every lie, every misstep, every attempt to manipulate the narrative had been exposed. Now he faced the jury, the final arbiters of his fate. Cole, his attorney, whispered hurriedly, scanning the jurors as they entered. His normally calm, calculating demeanor had given way to tension and urgency. "We've lost momentum," he muttered. "We need a miracle." Harris shook his head minutely, eyes fixed on the small figure in the gallery. "No miracles left," he whispered, almost to himself. "Just consequences." Judge Carver called the court to order. "Members of the jury have returned?" The 4-person stood, clutching a folded piece of paper. The room fell silent, the kind of heavy silence that presses on every soul present. Cameras flashed, pens hovered, and the collective breath of spectators and reporters seemed to pause in anticipation. The 4-person cleared their throat. "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty on all counts of negligence and misconduct in the use of a police K-9. The words rang out, absolute and final. A gasp traveled through the courtroom. Emily's guardian whispered something softly into her ear, and Emily looked up, wide-eyed, as if sensing that her words, her small, unassuming words, had carried the weight of justice itself. Harris's face drained of color. He remained seated, frozen, unable to speak, his carefully constructed image of authority shattered beyond repair. Cole opened his mouth, perhaps to protest, but the judge silenced him. "Sergeant Harris," Judge Carver said, voice steady but firm, "the court acknowledges the jury's verdict. Sentencing will proceed accordingly." Court is adjourned. The courtroom erupted into subdued murmurs. Reporters scrambled to capture reactions. Spectators whispered in awe. And through it all, Emily, unaware of her role in the historic moment, hugged her teddy bear, eyes shining with innocence and quiet courage. Outside the courthouse, the world seemed to vibrate with the news. National media outlets broadcast the verdict live, replaying clips of Emily's testimony, the officers' statements, and the images of the raid. Social media exploded with commentary, debate, and widespread acknowledgement of the smallest voice in the room that had altered the course of justice. Headlines splashed across screens. Child witness leads to historic police. Accountability, 3-year-old's words confirm misconduct. Officer convicted, innocence triumphs. Toddler's testimony reshapes justice inside. Harris was escorted from the courtroom, still pale and subdued. His K9, now a silent observer in a separate holding area, remained calm, unaware of the trial's conclusion. The leash, once a symbol of control and authority, had become emblematic of the consequences he now faced. Emily, meanwhile, returned home with her guardian. She played quietly in the backyard, blissfully unaware of the ripples she had set in motion. Every laugh, every step, every crayon stroke on paper was now a quiet affirmation that truth and courage could be found in the smallest of packages. Reynolds sat in her office that evening, reviewing the trial's footage and notes. Each witness, each statement, and every small crayon drawing had reinforced the power of honesty. She smiled faintly, knowing that while the law had been served, the story's true victory lay in a child's courage to speak plainly. The verdict resonated beyond the courtroom. The police department implemented stricter oversight on K9 deployment. Training programs were revised. Policies were rewritten. And across the country, officers and citizens alike discussed the implications. Accountability was not just a policy, but a moral imperative, one that could be initiated by anyone, regardless of age or status. Emily, for her part, continued to grow and play, her simple bravery having forever changed lives. Her guardian often recounted the story to friends and family, careful to honor Emily's privacy while highlighting the profound impact of her words. Emily herself did not boast, did not seek recognition. She simply continued to be a child, unaware that her innocence had sparked systemic change. Harris's conviction served as a cautionary tale within the department and across law enforcement. It reminded those in positions of power that authority was not above accountability, that every action had consequences, and that even the smallest voices could demand truth. In the weeks that followed, Emily's drawings were displayed at a local community center as part of a campaign promoting child safety and awareness. The German Shepherd, reassigned and retrained under new oversight, continued its service, but with lessons learned, boundaries reinforced, and control protocols strictly adhered to. Reynolds, reflecting on the trial, recognized the remarkable alignment of events that led to justice. A child's clear observation, courage to speak, and the willingness of honest officers to corroborate created an unassailable truth. It was a testament to the resilience of honesty, the power of evidence, and the profound impact one small voice could have on an entire system. Years later, Emily would remember fragments of the trial. Not the fear, not the chaos, but the sense that speaking clearly, honestly, and bravely could change the world. And in that small, innocent understanding lay a lesson that no adult testimony, no legal precedent, and no procedural argument could ever fully capture. The smallest voices sometimes carry the largest power, and as the sun set over the city, the courthouse stood quiet, the echoes of a historic trial lingering in its walls. Justice had been spoken, accountability achieved, and a 3-year-old's 2 simple words had forever changed the lives of everyone who had witnessed them. Truth, courage, and innocence had prevailed.